Welcome back from the coffee break, everybody. Hope you were able to continue the conversations that we couldn't get you to stop before the break, and hope it was a nice networking time. So I need to find where we are. There we are. We're going to look at the thematic part of the meeting now, which is probably why most of you also wanted to come today. So very exciting. And for this thematic part of the meeting, the plan is that we're going to have a little bit of input from both of the networks on the work that we're each doing as it relates to the theme of why we've come together today. And then we have a really great panel for you today with 3 brilliant speakers. So we have Kemi online. Hello. And then to my right, we have Lauren. And to my left, we have Jamie. And we're going to introduce you all in turn as well. Then there's going to be time for a Q&A with everybody in the plenary. And then we also made space and time for breakout groups, which will be facilitated by the 3 speakers. So if you have further questions to them or the specific theme that they talked about was of particular interest to you, then please join them in the breakout groups. And after that, there will be a little bit of time for report backs, because we want to hear from you not just on thematic reflections about today's meeting, but also on how can we strengthen collaboration between our 2 networks, which is also why we're here today. And then we're just going to close the meeting. And as we said, there's also a little bit of further socializing time for those who want to stay on in a nice air-conditioned space, which I think is what's needed. So I'll just start with a little bit of framing input from GADN's side, and then I'll hand it over to Julia for the same from the SRHR network. And so as GADN, we don't do dedicated work on SRHR because the SRHR network is our sister network. And so that's also why we don't have a working group, but rather we direct people towards the network for this particular work. But obviously there are lots of connections. And this is also why we framed the way the meeting in the way we did. So shared front lines between general gender justice advocacy and specific SRHR advocacy, particularly I think as it relates to rollback and anti-gender and anti-rights movements. And I could hear earlier that the advocacy breakout space already talked about that a lot, so that was great. And so I don't need to tell you that obviously that is accelerating across the board. And I think the anti-gender and anti-rights actors are just increasingly well-funded, really well-coordinated, and it's all exacerbated as well, obviously, by the shrinking civic space, larger democratic backsliding, and also the funding cuts across the board. And as I mentioned, I think we all know that SRHR is often the first frontier of that kind of rollback that's occurring. And as I mentioned, that is kind of how we conceptualize this meeting about our shared front lines as well. And we think that really we need to move beyond the silos of looking at, okay, SRHR advocates are working on this part of it, and then others are working on this part. And so we're really grateful to you all for being here so that we have some time for shared strategizing as well. So as I mentioned, I wanted to give a little bit of an update. Hi, Katie. It's all good. On the work on rollback that GADN has been doing. So you might have seen that in April, we published a briefing, which Sinead also mentioned earlier, and that is looking specifically at the UK government and what we want to see from them in terms of action on pushing back against the rollback. And it's outlining different multilateral spaces and includes concrete recommendations of what we would suggest they should do there. But it also includes a lot of context on what do we actually mean when we talk about rollback, who are anti-gender actors, lots of definitions, and also lots of examples, because surprisingly, the FCDO, at least the people we interact with, often still ask for examples to show that this is really happening. I don't know if it's the same in your work, but so we felt, okay, let us give you a lot of examples, and not just about SRHR, but across the board and how this is all interconnected. Then in terms of sort of political analysis, I mean, we all know that it's a little bit of uncertain in terms of the political situation in the UK. We don't know who's going to come into the cabinet. Will the prioritization of women and girls be retained? But certainly in the international strategic framework, we were pleased to see that there is still a mention of rollback, because at some point it felt like that isn't really part of their conceptualization of this work anymore. And we were told this is not a term that really lands and we need to think about it differently. But they did include it in the end, and there was some analysis on it, so that was great. And I think, yeah, we're just really looking to see how this is going to play out under the new Prime Minister and also with the FCDO restructure. I think there were some rumors that there might be increased capacity again on tackling rollback, so that would be great, but remains to be seen. I think for those of you who are also advocating towards the UK in different multilateral spaces, they were quite good, I think, in different recent ones, like CPD, for instance, where we've heard positive things and they stood up to what they actually said they were going to do, which was positive. And a space that we as GADN have also been following is the G7, where obviously it's really tricky with it being such a small group and an illegitimate space anyway, but that's a different story. And with the US around the table, and the space really focused on sort of building consensus and then not standing up for gender equality at all. And there was no mention of gender equality, but at least the mention of women and girls included sort of a human rights-based approach and the full achievement of their full freedoms or something along those lines, which felt relatively progressive, given that the US was around the room and it was still consensus. And so FCDO said that that seems to be the new line that the US is prepared to go with. So just to say that maybe there's a little bit of hope. We also need a little bit of hope. Maybe some people put stuff on the hope wall during the break, so trying to go there. But I think in terms of the UK's approach to rollback under the previous Conservative government, there was actually a little bit more dedicated work on this. So they had dedicated people working on this. They had a dedicated strategy. I'm not saying it was perfect, but at least there was some more dedicated focus. And I'm hoping that that will return after all this turmoil is over, hopefully. And I think one of the key things that we would hope to see is a bit more of a holistic approach to rollback. So also seeing, for instance, how some of their work in other areas is actually accelerating the rollback. So for example, how them pushing smart economics and this increasing focus on growth as the only way to measure development and the push towards private finance can all contribute to accelerating rollback as well. And also how their reluctance, for instance, to meaningfully engage with colonial legacies is actually creating openings for anti-rights actors to then come in and say, well, we don't want to listen to these former colonizers anyway. And gender is just a Western concept, right? Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there in terms of context from our side. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Julia.
My page already. Thanks, Yamina. That was really comprehensive. I'm not going to talk about rollback as much because I feel like Yamina's done a great job at sort of giving sort of where the FCDO are at. But just to say, a lot of the work that the SRHR community does is rooted in tackling rollback. Like, we don't exist outside of anti-rights actors. We are the entry point for anti-rights actors. The work that we do is always under attack by anti-rights actors. So I think, you know, we operate in a world in which that is the base. Abortion is under attack, contraception is under attack, fertility is under, all of the work, CSE is under attack, comprehensive sex education, is under attack. So, you know, that is the baseline that we are always working under, and we are following that and monitoring that, and as much as possible working as a community to tackle that as well. But outside of that, I would say, you know, as Yamina mentioned, the FCDO is in a bit of a particular difficult situation at the moment. So we have a really good relationship with the SRHR team, but the team lead of the SRHR team has actually left or is leaving very, very soon. Vicky Spencer, some of you may know her. She's been around for nearly 20 years, I believe. I think that was the number 12. I know, something with a 2 in it. So clearly, yeah, more than 2, but it has a 2. And we're losing quite a significant ally in that team. And there's going to be a lot of shift. So I think we're just operating under that basis at the moment until we know what's going to happen with SRHR. Also, we know that we have a new prime minister, a new cabinet, possibly a new foreign secretary, international development minister, lots of change possibly on the horizon. So, you know, the next 6 to 12 months will be really about how can we hold the line on SRHR and make sure that still remains a political priority for the FCDO. But just some if people are interested, some where we're at on sort of the financial situation and the political situation on SRHR. So in the ODA cuts, I would say, as a result of a lot of advocacy within the joint advocacy within the network and within the SRHR community, I would say SRHR was relatively protected in the cuts. You know, we did see quite significant enough cuts to wish, and I'm sure Bethan would be up to if people have questions around what that looked like, but around 30% cuts to wish, which is the flagship SRHR program from the FCDO, and we had a cut of 20% to UNFPA as well, which were 2 of the biggest cuts that we saw. But you know, we were anticipating up to 70 to 80% cuts. So I think that joint advocacy really did work, and that was a clear success. You know, despite that, just the numbers report that we did with the Guttmacher Institute last year showed that a 30% decrease in funding for reproductive health and family planning would mean 3.3 million fewer women and couples served. So we're still looking at quite a significant cut to reproductive health. And UNFPA more broadly, cuts to them, including from USAID, saw 38% fewer people met with GBV prevention service and 33% fewer people with SRHR services in 2025 compared to 2024. So it's quite a significant cut that we're seeing. The 8th replenishment to the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria was 15% lower than the 7th replenishment in 2022, which was it was good to get that replenishment, but obviously it's a cut in real terms as well. But we've seen lots of humanitarian funding to SRHR, particularly through UNFPA, but also through sort of midwifery programs to Gaza, Afghanistan, Syria, and more as well. So, you know, financially, we're in an interesting position on humanitarian funding, which is great. Politically, SRHR shows up in the Women and Girls framework. It's quite strong. You know, lots of references to neglected areas like comprehensive sex education, safe abortion. It sets out a really interesting approach to expanding access to commodities and services, mobilizing innovative financing, etc. But we don't know how it's going to show up in the VORG work that the Foreign Secretary is leading. We don't even know if the VORG work is going to go ahead because there's going to probably be a new Foreign Secretary. So, but you know, there's still work to be done there about the implementation of this Women and Girls framework. Like, how do we actually get that done? The UK have been really tapped into the UN80 discussion, so the reform of the UN system, particularly the merger between UNFPA and UN Women, which we're concerned would dilute some of the mandates of SRHR in the multilateral space. But they're involved, they're asking for information, they want positioning, and the same with CPD and CSW. We've had good feedback from CPD that the UK government was really strong on SRHR in that space. CPD is the Commission on Population and Development. It's basically the SRHR version of CSW. There is, like, obviously Yamina spoke about it, there's more work to be done on the rollback work, but as a community, many organizations are working, and Jamie will speak about this a little bit more, on monitoring the anti-rights movement, monitoring these global health compacts that might have an impact on SRHR sort of implementation in country, and also monitoring just like the general expanded global gag rule, the protecting human flourishing in foreign assistance. So if life and families and all these kind of things. So we are monitoring that, and lots of organizations are working collaboratively on that too. We focused on, just very quickly, the anti-rights movement, humanitarian response, and working in partnership with the global majority and grassroots organizations, because these are clear priorities for FCDO across all of their areas of work. So I think it'll be interesting to find those connections with all of you guys and bring these two communities together. Sorry, that was way more than 5 minutes.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Julia. That was really helpful to set the scene. And now we can turn to our first amazing panelist online, Kemi. So obviously, I think most of us are probably focused towards the UK government and our advocacy, but we thought it would be really great to, in addition to brilliant Lauren and Jamie, also bring Kemi in, who can bring a bit more of that global perspective as well. So she's Voz Feminista's Chief Global Advocacy Officer and leads the organization's Global Advocacy for Change unit. Kemi is a feminist thought leader and connector in women's sexual and reproductive justice movements, and her intersectional feminist voice and deep experience in movement building and trust-based grant making. Kemi also brings more than 20 years of experience working in partnerships with women's rights organizations, funds, and feminist and social justice movements in Africa and globally. And throughout her career, she has been an activist for SRHR, rights and justice, and has built close relationships with feminist SRHR organizations and leaders in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean and the Pacific. So we're really, really thankful to be joined by you today, Kemi, and so lovely to see you again. And take it away. Over to you.
No, thank you. And hi, everyone. I know it's a little bit awkward. I'm probably I think the only face in the little box. So please just bear with me. I'll try
You're a
as
big
much
box
as
for us, so
possible.
it's all good.
No, but it's really great to be amongst you all and just to share some of my perspective. I'm really happy to hear Julia actually speak to many of the things that I'm also going to mention as well, through the work that we've been doing. And I know that, I'm particularly excited to see these two networks in the same room really thinking together, and even some of my responses are going to speak to why we need more of these kind of conversations and more of these kind of spaces, especially in this moment in time where we're seeing not just only fiscal contraction, but we're actually seeing the growth in authoritarianism across the globe. So I guess maybe I wanted to just start off, first of all, in terms of, just reflecting a lot around, the UK's role, especially in terms of what can be done right now. What more do we need from the UK in terms of being able to defend and to continue to support SRHR more broadly? And I was really happy to hear about the UN80 reforms. This is a work that my team and myself been working very closely with the cross feminist coalition. Um, and really trying to see how we can be able to safeguard SRHR within that space, but also gender equality. And I think the biggest risk, as it has been identified, obviously, it's the merger between UNFPA and UN Women. And if I don't want to go into a lot of details, but I do think that for folks that are not following that, if you follow the Feminist Cross Coalition, you can be able to get a lot of information on LinkedIn in terms of positions and ideas, and analysis, and even proposals that we've put forward as alternatives to these merger conversation that's being put on the table. But beyond just, the merger between UNFPA and UN Women, of course, the sunsetting of UNAIDS as well being a critical piece that we're also significantly concerned about. So I do think that in this particular moment in time, it's really important for us to continue to hold the UK to hold them accountable to continuing to defend SRHR and defend gender equality across these multilateral spaces. So whether it's pushing back against what's it called, the merger, or whether that is looking at how UNAIDS is sunsetted, because I think that it's a foregone conclusion now, in the most responsible way, in which like key elements of that mandate and that work is not lost, including the piece around civil society participation, because I think this is one of the few agencies that had very strong civil society leadership, engagement, especially at the board level, and how that can continue to live on, even if the entity or the vehicle for which is going to deliver on that mandate is not the same or doesn't look the same. I 100% agree with the analysis that were provided earlier in terms of the role the UK has played, and they did actually play, I think, really a strong bridging role during CPD, the Commission on Population and Development, and was very much appreciated. I think the UK was probably one of the few global North countries that actually wanted to look at the issues around right to development and look at the issues around trade and debt, and have a conversation. I'm not saying, and looking at issues like, for example, technology transfer, which was a really core sticky point during the CPD negotiation, and was really trying to bring other governments on board, especially many of the other governments, European, well, the EU as a whole was not great, was problematic. But really trying to be able to bring them on board to try and see how we could use that as a basis, because we should not forget that there is an increasing polarization on this issue. And as Yamina had mentioned, the fact that there is a growing anti-West, anti-global North a sentiment across the global South, and particularly very ripe and very, very active in terms of the Africa region. Many of those sentiments, are rightly founded because of the colonial histories that have been mentioned, but also because of some of the very on equal practices, trade practices, etc. And I don't need to speak to GADN members on this because I feel like this is stuff that you guys are quite aware of and engaged. So I think we need to continue to push the UK government around specific language in terms of the existing multilateral negotiations. But we need to remember that we are also we're at the point right now where the post-2030 agenda is going to start. From this HLPF, which is the High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which is ending, I think, tomorrow. We've already launched, that's already serving as the first launching pad into this conversation of what the next global development agenda is going to look like. And many of us are, quite concerned that, of course, SRHR and gender equality will be on the chopping block, giving the pattern we've seen in the existing negotiations, be it at CSW or even be it at CPD. And if every single time what we are seeing is only global North countries actually speaking up about SRHR, it creates a problem, because then that continues to become this carrot that is being traded off in ways that are, are extremely, extremely problematic. And that we need to be able to look at how we can push government, and particularly the UK government, to continue to show that these things are not separate issues, they're interlinked. This is about addressing some of the structural drivers that limit our ability to deliver on SRHR. And so we need to take a more integrated approach and to look at how we make sure that even in negotiations, these issues are tied together in a way that, be it global North countries or even some member states in the global South that are acting in anti-rights ways are unable to just throw it out because there's something in there for them, and vice versa. And so I think that that's something that we need to really sort of like continue to push the UK government in terms of putting language that connects these two issues in a very, very strategic way, so that it's more unlikely to be thrown under the bus. I also think, as we are talking more about, I heard, yes, from the earlier speaker about the fact that SRHR has been protected, but it's not totally so, because we are seeing funding from the UK government being cut at national level, and the ODA supports to specific countries. I mean, Sierra Leone is a perfect example of that. And what's happening is that we are seeing other donors ceding space to the likes of the United States and the America First Global Health Strategy, in which we know is going to really sort of push back and roll back and put governments, especially governments in the global majority, in a very precarious situation in which they're going to have to think about taking funding to protect some elements of SRHR, maybe maternal health, or some elements of that. But we're going to see a loss in contraceptive access. We're going to see a loss in terms of adolescent health. We are seeing there's potentially implications in terms of like what kind of commodities are going to be procured in country, at the same time that we're seeing defunding of UNFPA, who potentially has the space to be able to fill in the gaps in terms of matching funds to support national governments to ensure that contraceptive commodities are secure and available in country. And so even in countries where the UK government is still providing investments and providing ODA, I think it's also important for us to ask them to use that opportunity to also ask national governments about, what is going to be the impact of those governments that sign on to the America First Global Health Strategy and the compacts. What is going to be its implication even on their investments that they're making? Because then this allows us to be able to better understand what the risks are, because this entire conversation is shrouded in secrecy, and civil society is not necessarily involved in a lot of the negotiations, but also even in terms of the plans that are being rolled out. So I do think that the UK government and for many of you that are in the room can actually use your voice and your power to be able to push to say, we need to see, what the funding that's coming from the US government, what the conditionalities are and what impact that's having on SRHR, especially if for example, the UK government is actually providing resources in those countries as well. And the final thing I will say about, how we can continue to sustain this push is, with the growing momentum of anti-rights and anti-gender actors, even in the UK, we need to really keep a clear eye on ensuring that no funding from FCDO is going to these actors. This is a big risk. And it's something that I think that many of you in the room are best positioned to be able to keep an eye on and to be able to continue to track and to raise alarm if such things are happening. We've had several studies, be it work that's been done by EPF, the European Parliamentary Forum, or done by the ICE. Oh my God, my brain is lacking in terms of the investigative journalism. Please forgive me that I've forgotten their name. But research that has been done by them have shown that funding is coming from folks that are allies and going to support anti-rights and anti-gender movements as well. And so it's really important for us to be able to look at how we can hold them accountable for that, and ensuring that resources are not going inadvertently to support the movements that we're trying to push back against, and who have made significant progress in terms of rolling back rights. I don't know, Yamina, you're looking at me, so I'm assuming that
Yes.
I'm probably running low on time. So just,
I was trying to do it telepathically. I'm glad it worked.
Yes, I'm seeing you turn back. So I think, I know that like we've talked a lot about anti-rights and anti-gender, and I know Jamie's coming on board. Jamie's going to speak a lot more as well. I don't want to go so much into it, but I do think that like what I'm seeing on the ground that is giving me hope is the fact that even with the current challenges, the growth in authoritarian governments, the fiscal contraction that we're seeing, I'm seeing, for me, and experiencing more collaboration amongst movements. A perfect example is the recently concluded Interparliamentary Conference on African families and sovereignty that was done, and to look at how different organizations, even before the meeting that happened in Ghana, even previous meetings, have been coming together and pulling limited resources. No one has the big pot of money to do everything on their own. But we have seen and have experienced and been part of collective response work, in which some people are bringing 5,000, somebody saying, you know what, I can bring 10,000 here. And that sort of like collaboration is really helping to be able to move money into like frontline defenders in the countries where these conferences are being held, to reveal and expose as one strategy, but to also counter some of the narratives. So we saw that in Ghana, we saw that in Liberia, in the work that Foss did with, for example, We Are Purposeful. We've seen that in Uganda with the work that we've done with folks in CIRC, with AMWA, Akina Mamawa Africa, Zamara Foundation. Like, we need to continue to do that because the reality is that like we're not going to have all the resources to be able to continue to do this in the way that we've unfortunately worked very siloed through our work. But I think also like the importance of us actually being able to raise our voices, even in contexts when people cannot raise their voice. And I know I'm going to say this, but for example, we've seen, I don't know how many of you know that the permanent rep from Costa Rica got a lot of backlash back at home after CSW. The Costa Rica has officially defined itself as a pro-life they didn't call themselves anti-rights and anti-gender, but a pro-life nation. And we're seeing how they're actually trying as much as possible to walk back the amazing work that Ambassador Chen did in New York against the United States. But the US is playing a bullying arm. But what we are seeing now is that like activists from other countries are raising alarm about this, because activists in Costa Rica cannot speak about this in the same way because of the experiences. So I think this transnational solidarity that is about raising visibility about the issue but also finding ways to be able to speak publicly about the issues in ways that people that are doing it at home cannot do it, or in their national capacity cannot do it, is extremely important. We're seeing that in Uganda right now, as we speak, you know? So we need to do a little bit more, do more there. And maybe the last thing, Yamina, I will say is that where are the opportunities for us to do this? Hi.
Sorry. Can we wrap up in like 10 seconds? Is that okay?
10 seconds.
Thank
The
you.
big question I want to throw to everybody in the room, I guess, is where can we do more of this in terms of looking at that solidarity between the global majority and the global north? I think that's where we are already having the same issues, you know, the anti-trans movement and engagement in the UK. It's not different from what we're seeing around the anti-LGBTQI laws and bills that are being passed on the continent, in Africa. So where is it that we can think through strategies to be able to do stronger collaborations with others in the global south, or the global majority, around shared harm and around shared issues and priorities? And that would be something that I would love to be able to continue the conversation when we go into breakout rooms, to look at what strategies makes the most sense given where our respective strengths and powers actually lie. I'll stop there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kemi. There was so much in there. Round of applause. I hope you can hear this. That was absolutely brilliant. I'll pass to Jess to introduce Jamie, and hopefully we'll have time in the breakout, as you say, to continue the conversation as well.
So over to Jamie, who's our second panelist. Jamie is a senior researcher at IPAS, tracking and reporting on global anti-rights movements and threats to sexual and reproductive health and rights and gender justice. With over 15 years experience in research, policy analysis and advocacy, she has led on investigations in Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean on the impacts of the US foreign assistance, crackdowns on civil society and human rights violations, focusing on women's, children's and LGBTQI+ rights. Thank you.
And technically it's 5 minutes.
Okay, I've been asked to talk about transnational organizing, the US, and opportunities for the UK government. So I'm going to try to do that in 5 minutes and not repeat too much of already what's been wonderfully said by Kemi and others. I did want to start on one of the points that Kemi ended on, which is the same strategy that we're seeing if we think about the anti-trans policies and the rest in the UK and the anti-LGBTQI bills and revisions of constitutions that we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, and to talk about playbooks. I think many of us in the room have heard of Alliance Defending Freedom. And so I just want to pause on that note, because I think we talk about rollback, we talk about pushback, we talk about anti-rights and anti-gender. And I think to sort of level set, we are talking about transnational organizing. All of us know that there has been anti-gender, anti-abortion as part of, whether we want to call it conservative Christian right, Catholic, beyond for time memoriam. But one of the things, this point about transnational organizing and why Alliance Defending Freedom is cropping up in the UK, why they're at the European Parliament, why they're in Geneva, why they're in East Africa, partnering with local organizations and advising different groups. That's the piece that we're looking at. And IPAS has been doing, we keep on saying we've been doing this work for 15 years. I think my colleague Jillian has been doing it for 20 years at IPAS. But that's that, we talk about bad actors. And those are the ones that we've been following largely from the US for the most part to begin with. The Family Watch Internationals that many of you have heard from, obviously Alliance Defending Freedom, the Heritage Foundation and the rest, and how they have exported those strategies and tactics and models. We actually put out a report earlier this year on youth mobilization of the far right that's been happening for 100 years. And it's a model that, again, we're talking about a specific model. We're not talking about what it looks like with the far right groups that have always used young people, again, for the last 100 years, but that model of recruitment and professionalization and pipelines. You might know the name Leonard Leo. He specifically talks about creating talent pipelines, and this is where the far right, the anti-rights, are so much better in investing in structures and systems than the progressive donors are who focus on elections. And a snapshot of, sorry, I'm looking at the two young people in the room. They focus on you when it's election time, not to fund you to succeed as you progress through your careers, and for the rest of us as well who have careers in this. So just noting that one point about the transnational organizing that we're talking about that is now so, yes, funded by dark money and billionaires. We're funded by billionaires too. Like, we shouldn't shy away from that. And the fact that they are in it for the long haul, step by step, guiding people through their careers to the next positions of power. And we see that with the far right gains in Latin America in the last few months. You see that with Bardella in France and other European far right young people who are coming up the ranks. So just want to level set a bit what we're talking about. I'm not going to talk about who they are. We've sort of touched on that with religious actors, advocacy groups, and the rest. I've named a few of them. But this interaction with, unfortunately, we have to talk about the Trump administration. And we started talking about the MOUs as well. But that playbook that Heritage created, there is a playbook for 2028 here in the UK already. Like, that is here, and that's the types of things we need to look out for and raise alarms with our colleagues here. And I think it's someone actually at MSI who talks about, with Trump, there was phase one of dismantling, and I feel like we've already forgotten about Doge, but that happened. And now we're in this reconstruction phase of using those ideologies, those playbooks, and putting them into practice of what that looks like to have a highly transactional foreign assistance, and being wary that we are going to see that in other contexts, depending on who gets elected where. So again, as Kemi spoke about, those other cuts to ODA, defunding of UNFPA, the merger and all of how that plays into this. So just to speak a little bit about those MOUs, already with the way that the US government has restructured global health, there is no funding for family planning and reproductive health, point blank. So that's the reality that we're operating in on one hand. On the other hand, this money that's coming in is, and I'm sorry if other people know this too well, I can kind of go quickly and we can talk about it later, but already you're restricting the universe and removing that element, and you're forcing co-financing from countries, which means they're going to be putting in money to meet those buckets that are approved, which does include maternal and child health, HIV, TB, and malaria. But what does it mean for a country that has to restrict its co-financing to that area and domestic resource mobilization for the nicely named FPRH, SRHR, however we want to call it? So what does it look like moving forward for the next 5 years if we're in that situation, and the rest of ODA cuts? And where does resource mobilization come from in that area? So, and then, God, I've been asked not to swear. Then you add, we add in the expanded global gag rule, protecting human flourishing and foreign assistance. Thank you, Heritage, for that nice language. So yeah, on top of the funding issue, you have this policy. So the actors that are remaining are going to be gagged by that. All that means for things that we know about chilling effects for people who are able to continue getting US funding assistance. So we're talking about services that are linked to abortion information, contraception, obviously integrated maternal health services, GBV response. Kemi mentioned youth outreach and LGBTQ inclusion. All of that is vulnerable. And we know from State Department guidance and other documents, addenda that was released for Nigeria, Uganda, and my brain retains some things and then it doesn't. I can't remember the third country off the top of my head, but they're called the addenda. I can send you all of this stuff, but basically they say we want to partner with faith-based actors. And there is fundamentally nothing wrong with that. We know that church plays a huge role. And as many of you are nodding, we also know what that means for service integration and availability of contraception and other services of choice. So just painting that picture of what is happening with this administration is deeply tied to all of those ideologies we've heard from the Heritage, the ADFs, and the rest. Like, this is part of that package. And unfortunately, changes right now in the State Department means someone else is going to come in who is even more ideologically aligned than the guy who just moved to a new position. So we are going to see this in a situation already where the US government is cracking down on specific organizations. So obviously, the UK is not just a bystander in all of this, as we said. It is already extraordinarily vulnerable to anti-rights organizing. Amnesty has done recent mapping. We did work earlier this year with MSI, IPPF, and the European Parliamentary Forum on gender and security to show those vulnerabilities, both from domestic anti-rights mobilizing from Russia and Hungary and others, as everybody, all of these people love to play in the pool together at CPAC and in other organizing areas. It's truly terrifying how much they like to get together. And we see that here a few weeks ago. There was the ARC conference, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. Tommy Robinson had one of his second Unite the Kingdom rallies last year. It happened the day after the March for Life rally as well. So again, you're seeing the anti-abortion, anti-trans, far-right neo-Nazis who invite politicians from far-right other governments to come in, other parties, sorry, all, again, playing in the sandbox together. And then we see, Alliance Defending Freedom and Ordo Juris from Poland using the legal policy playbooks, and that is happening right now in the UK. I know a lot of you are nodding and you know a lot of this, but it's just to show how all of these themes are being packaged together for this wider political audience across anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, abortion, anti-Muslim, all of those narratives together. And this is where we get to, and please start doing this if I need to wrap up. So again, as I'm sure you know, anti-gender politics functions less as a single issue than this organizing language. And that links all of we were talking about this in our group, legitimate grievances into that political identity. And again, it's the same thing we're seeing in the MOUs. It's the same thing we're hearing from some of these groups, and it's all about national decline and safety and an identity. So just to say that for the UK, again, I'm not going to touch on the international space, but we need continued strong action in those spaces. And again, not just as a counter to the US. We need to be looking at what's going to be happening in France, what's going to be happening in Germany, what's going to happen in the UK. So all that to say, it's unfortunately a policy environment that is becoming more hostile. The UK is part of that battleground, if we want to use that language. And so if the goal is to protect our SRHR and gender equality, then the response, and again, this is what Kemi was saying, where she was talking about hope, is to be better coordinated. And it's wonderful. I mean, thank you for having me. This is my first time in either of your spaces. I've kind of fled the US, frankly. And beyond this, we need to be better coordinated. It's going to be about bringing in climate. And it's wonderful to be here with Amnesty, where you do have a more holistic look at a lot of these things. But we as different movements need to move beyond this at some point. Yeah, I will stop there.
Thanks so much, Jamie. That was great. And so much in there as well that we can hopefully follow up on. Okay. I will introduce Lauren. So last but certainly not least, we have Lauren Ahrens, who is the Senior Advisor on Gender, Conflict and International Justice at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International. She has also held a number of other roles within the organization, including as head of the gender team and as researcher advisor on gender. Lauren has also worked as not the right page, one second, human rights advisor to the UN Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Syria and a human rights officer in Gaza, Palestine, both with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Lauren has also worked with the International Rescue Committee in Northwest Pakistan and with the El Mizan Center for Human Rights in Gaza. Thank you so much for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm speaking from a slightly different perspective. My work is on human rights investigations on gender and conflict globally. And I'm sort of sharing some of my reflections on SRHR from that particular context. And I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation, because one of the things that always really concerns me is so much of the conversations that I hear about or learn about when it comes to gender and conflict and humanitarian action are conversations that often begin and end on conflict-related sexual violence, and why I think that's so incredibly important. It's, obviously there's so many other issues we need to be looking at, and I don't think that SRHR in the conflict and humanitarian context gets the kind of attention that it really needs and deserves. So again, it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm currently leading Amnesty International's investigation into what we've concluded, and others have of course concluded, as a genocide in Gaza, looking at the gendered impacts of that genocide. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some of my reflections from that. And again, they're sort of not reflections that are just limited to that, but they come out maybe in particularly intense and strong ways in that context. But I want to start just briefly with an account of someone that I spoke to a couple of weeks ago, because I think it's sort of quite telling. I spoke to a woman, I'll call her Amina, and she was telling us how in November 2023, she began to miscarry. So she was rushed to a hospital and she needed an emergency hysterectomy. And she was recovering in the hospital when the hospital was raided. And in the context of that raid, she lost her husband. He disappeared. She doesn't know if he's been killed or if he's alive in Israeli detention. So she returned home grieving both the loss of her fertility and also the loss of her husband. And since then, she's trying to care for her children in basically impossible conditions with ongoing severe pelvic pain. And I wanted to tell that story because, like so many other accounts of people we hear, it's not simply about healthcare failures. It is about healthcare failures, but it's not only about healthcare failures. It's about attacks on healthcare. It's about displacement. It's about hunger. It's about insecurity. And it's about enforced disappearance of family members. And ultimately, it's about international humanitarian law, or very connected to it, and whether that was being respected. And your point, the point that other panelists have been making about the need to sort of break down silos to work with others, I really agree, and I want to add to that, because over the years of doing human rights investigations on gender and conflict, it's increasingly struck me that sexual reproductive health and rights depends so deeply on the wider protection environment, and that respect for international humanitarian law isn't separate from sexual and reproductive rights. It's a sort of really, really necessary precondition for it. Unfortunately, of course, international humanitarian law is also deeply under attack. Relatedly, but a second thing we're also seeing that is often seen across conflicts, and particularly we're seeing in Gaza, is how women's reproductive health is shaped by an accumulation of so many different gendered harms. So I could give you another example. A woman I recently spoke to called Noor, whose baby died last year soon after he was born. And her pregnancy and loss wasn't shaped by one event. It was shaped by repeated displacement, inadequate food, disrupted antenatal care, chronic stress. And these harms accumulated in a very premature birth. But the issue she faced didn't end there, because as soon as her baby was born prematurely, she wasn't able to get emergency neonatal care for him. The point I'm making is, if baby is born with complications into a health system that can't provide adequate care, you've got one set of harms then being reinforced and added to by another one. From that perspective, there's several areas in our research that I just sort of wanted to flag that we see as really crucial to prioritize. The first is continuing to make the case that sexual and reproductive rights in conflict contexts and humanitarian contexts is not a standalone humanitarian issue. It so deeply depends not only on healthcare, but also protection, food security, shelter, humanitarian access. It's really an interconnected reality. And then the second, is just to repeat the need for the respect for international humanitarian law at the heart of humanitarian advocacy, because without that foundation, access to sexual and reproductive health care and rights really is not possible. And then thirdly, I wanted to talk about ensuring the priorities of local feminists and other local organizations and how they shape decision-making from top to bottom in humanitarian responses, including funding plans and strategies. I'm still really continually surprised when I speak to states and speak to donors how rarely they're speaking to feminist groups, and especially some of the most marginalized feminist groups, as for example, they're developing their strategies. One of the things that I think gives us the most hope when we do our documentation work is the leadership and the reach and the skills of local feminist organizations and healthcare professionals. And they're really the ones, as you all know, that are there when international organizations have to evacuate or get scaled down or get deregistered and forced to leave. And there's so much space still for the humanitarian response to reflect that much better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for talking about those interlinkages and for bringing those stories as well to this room. Very valued. We've gone over time a little bit, but that's okay. We have a little bit of time now for Q&A with the speakers. So if anyone has a question, please just put your hand up and I'll come to you with the mic. We can collect a couple and then go back to speakers before we do the breakout groups.
Hi, I'm Chiara from Amnesty UK. I wanted to ask Jamie if you have any lessons from the US around how we can tackle regulators. So one of the things that, in our research, so we mapped like about 117 actors, like 30% are charities. And there's been cases of very recently gender critical charities being made like charities. Spoke to a charity commission, like they basically have clue, like they know, but it seems they can't do anything. And so then you have these organizations trying to infiltrate networks, like being accepted into networks because people are too scared. So I don't know if there's something from the US that we should know about, or I don't know. I'm really interested in this because I feel the charitable status is really like once they're in, and it's very difficult to get them out.
Other questions?
I hope this will sound really naive or just basic, but are there opportunities to work with faith organizations to counter some of because I was raised Catholic, there's always room within faith groups for people who don't agree with everything they're hearing about certain topics, or for instance, that they're being told things that aren't very Christian and doesn't actually have any religious basis. I suppose I'm just sort of optimistic that maybe there could be some more space there, which could be really helpful.
Hi, my question is towards Kemi and maybe to the broader panel as well, like sharing some more like specific or tangible examples, because I think that many of us in our respective roles and organizations seem to be having, I think, a similar conversation around needing to build coalitions, needing to work together, need to operate more like the far right so that we can be as effective as we think they are, and almost like kind of stargazing at them in a way that we think they're doing a better job at. So really, what are some tangible examples of where we are doing that, can be doing that, or should be doing that? I'd be really interested to hear what others are doing.
Okay, that's fine. Jamie, shall we start with you?
Thanks. We could have a whole love fest over the IRS. And frankly, one of the things I didn't talk about was how the ideological alignment with the US, and I will touch upon the faith-based question as well as part of this, is that there is regulation in the US doesn't no longer, if it ever did, favor progressive organizations. I mean, that's the structure of, in the US, you have 501c3 status. Religious groups are exempt from reporting. Like, this is why when we try to talk about the numbers and financing, I remember as part of the report we did on youth, I was trying to figure out the mapping of one of the older anti-rights youth organizations that's actually hundreds of smaller organizations because they're registered at the state level. So unfortunately, no. And what the administration did in the last month, in addition to releasing policy guidance on faith-based organizations, was to also start talking about, there's the Office of Management and Budget, which is seeking to press organizations to be more ideologically aligned with the administration. So unfortunately, lessons learned from this moment is actually possibly start engaging with those regulators now or 5 years ago to look at this and to look into organizations, because yeah, the IRS is not going to favor this moment. Already Trump has gone after climate organizations and the rest to try to get them deregulated in the US. So unfortunately, that's what I would say, is that work on engaging registration. And we know from work in other countries, for example, in Uganda, that none of the systems set up are set up to help charities and NGOs in these things. And we've seen, yeah, all these foreign agent laws that are coming throughout in many, many countries in which work. On the faith-based organization, sorry, I was taking notes, so I don't know who asked. It's something that we do at IPASS. I know that others do as well, is that it's a critical part, is engaging progressive faith-based organizations on certainly not just abortion or SRHR, but with youth and with, access and the rest. It's something that we all recognize is critical to moving this work forward. When I was talking about it in the US context, and this is public on the State Department, CRS has decided to accept US funding, and that's where, and it's unfortunate that CRS is being used as this example, but that is where the US talks about faith in action as part of its international, and the US government had always worked with faith-based organizations as well. I'm just saying that the problem is when it's going to be critical to the breakdown of referral networks and systems of care to be favoring certain types of organizations over others, and to be calling out and scapegoating, I mean, the MSIs and IPPFs in the room and others who have been traditional partners in these spaces, and it's how it's going to break down coalitions. And all that to say, it is now more important than ever to continue in working with faith-based groups to try to see the workarounds that can be done, knowing that part of the way the US funding works, especially when it has the global gag rule and all of those policy writers in it, is to fragment us. That is part of the goal. And this administration has been very clear in its hostilities towards civil society, unfortunately. Catholic Relief Services, CRS, sorry. I can, if Kemi can or doesn't want to, I can come back to other tangible.
Thank you. Yeah, Kemi, can we turn to you if there's anything to add
Sure.
on the faith-based groups, and then also the question of specific examples on coalition building, and then Lauren, if you also wanted to come in on either of them. Over to you, Kemi.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think those are really spot on. I want to preface by saying that within the SRHR movement, we have worked with faith-based institutions in the past. And I don't want to frame it that all of them are bad. I think there's been significant progress that we were able to make in terms of the HIV movement, but also in terms of access to contraception and family planning with certain groups within the broader faith ecosystem, that I think along the lines we kind of dropped. But there was progress that we made there. And to be quite frank and honest, I don't think that the amount of, especially particularly for the African continent, I think a lot of the progress that we did made was because we were able to bring a lot of faith-based entity on board in terms of even expanding access to treatment, even though on the prevention side, there's a lot of question marks on that in that regard. So I think there is a need for us to be able to do a bit of nuancing and identifying some of them. It's not all, like, for example, Pentecostal, or not all well, Catholics, we need to put in one bucket. That's a different conversation. But like, I think it's not all faith entities that have the same kind of positions. I'll give a really very specific example. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Mormon Church, so usually organizes every year the Strengthening Families conferences across the board. It's the Latter-day Saints Church. They do it across West Africa, in particular, and they've done a series of those conferences. And the last one was actually done in Liberia. We had been working, Force Feminista had been working with partners in Liberia, and they were able to mobilize the Religious Council of Liberia to issue a statement distancing themselves from the Strengthening Families Conference. Now, I'm sure some of you probably saw that because it made the media in some places, and that document, their press statement was out. Eventually, money traded hands behind the scenes, and they had gotten one or two people to try and redact that statement. But this actually came from years and years of working of many of the youth-led, because it was actually a youth-led organization that was actually able to deliver on that piece of the work. And they were able to get them to say, we don't support this Strengthening Families Conference because it actually is working against the development of young people of Liberia. And so I think for me, doing that piece of work in Liberia and doing a similar piece of work with We Are Purposeful in Sierra Leone, and actually doing a lot of work with faith-based entities and creating space for them to be able to think, to ask questions. It might not necessarily mean that we're going to get them from 0 to 100, right? But if we're able to get them from even 0 to 30, in which they're not in a place of putting out harm. So for example, in the Sierra Leone version of the conference, they actually were more they were more cautious when they were speaking, versus, Jamie's favorite friend, Greg Slater, was all out insulting CSE, insulting, like calling it the devil's work, etc. But the faith-based entities from Sierra Leone were a little bit more tapered in the things they were saying. And I have to, I think, add a bit of credit to the work that we did with We Are Purposeful before the conference to be able to have conversations with them about what is family and what are the strategies for strengthening family. So I think this is something that we need to continue to do. There's a bunch of folks, Jinsogi, Faith to Action, the Church of Sweden. There's a whole bunch of us now that are actually doing even more work in terms of how to build like a gender just, faith coalition. And there's going to be a conference in August as part of Sonke Gender Justice and Men Engage, in which we're going to have a pre-conference focusing specifically on faith entities and how to work with them to be able to do more work and be advocates for SRHR. And I think that that's extremely, extremely important for us to continue. But also recognizing that faith is not just only about Islam and Christianity. And I think that's the second piece I want to bring out, because we're also doing a bit more mobilization to bring traditional African religions into the conversation, because that's where we're going to break this monopoly that we're seeing in some of this context. So just wanting to say that. Then in terms of very concrete examples, in terms of what does this cross-movement building work look like, I have an example that we have done. So just a couple of days after the Interparliamentary Conference on family values and sovereignty, we organized something called the Haki Forum. It was not something that was branded Force Feminista, so many people would not know, but it was a space to be able to bring movements, representative from different movements. We brought people from food systems and food sovereignty. We brought folks that are doing work around economic justice. We brought folks that are working on religion, including those that are traditional African religions, shamas and orishas, etc. We brought folks from the academia and really put all of us in a room to have a conversation about what does sovereignty look like from a Pan-African, from an African liberation perspective. What was the unifying issue was sovereignty. It was not SRHR. It was not human rights. it was the issue of sovereignty, because in each of the spaces, each of these organizations could see how sovereignty was being weaponized against their issue. We brought climate folks. We brought folks that were working on rule of law and civic space. And we were all having this conversation and talking about how authoritarian governments, because we're all civil society, are using the issue of sovereignty to actually take away power from people. And that was a great experience, and one that, like, of course, there's a lot of building up on that needs to happen. But I think it's about finding what is that unifying issue. In Latin America, it's going to be totally different. You understand? In Africa, it's the issue of sovereignty because they see it. And many of these organizations didn't know anything about the Interparliamentary Conference. They didn't even care. But they wanted to engage with the conversation because you had, for example, a country like Ghana talking about the Accra Reset and talking about sovereignty when it comes to the issues of health. We're talking about sovereignty in terms of economic sovereignty. So we need to find threads that really sort of like link all of us together and use that as a space for creating opportunities for building trust and creating opportunities for us to jointly strategize together, because trust only comes from when we have to do work together. And I think that that is something that I can actually offer as a very concrete example. And if folks, Yamina, are interested in finding a bit more about the Haki Forum and connecting and seeing what has come out of that space, we're going to be organizing a webinar to do a debrief, and we'll be happy for folks to join that conversation.
Thank you so much, Kemi. Yeah, please do share and we can forward that to everybody. That's great. Lauren, you said you're fine to pass, right? Yeah. Just in the interest of time, Jess, can I pass you just to explain the breakout groups, where we'll have also an opportunity to talk more with the speakers. And if there are any other questions that maybe you were shy to ask now, you can ask them then. And then we'll start with the breakout groups and do a little comfort break at the start of that as well, if anyone needs to.
Thank you. Yes, so we're going to have 3 different breakout groups. I think we'll have the one with Kemi in this room, because obviously she's online. And then I think the other 2 we'll have outside. So there'll be one with Jamie and then one with Lauren. They'll all be facilitating. They have some guiding questions, but there's no pressure to respond to them. And it's kind of all just for you to have time to reflect, ask each other questions, kind of build more on what they've discussed. We kind of want to do it in sort of 2 stages. So there's a thematic reflections on the meeting, but also reflections on cross-network collaboration. Again, the facilitators will have the questions. And then we'll come back and have 1 reflection per group, and 1 on the thematic, and then 1 on the network collaboration. So if someone can also be prepared, maybe the facilitators, be prepared to just feedback on from the groups to what was discussed. Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.